This is a continuation of our speech productions, lecture systems and speech production. We've already talked about the respiratory system, the phonatory system. We did not talk about the articulatory system because that was going to be covered by Mrs. Basham in class in her section of the course. And so today we're going to talk about the nervous system. The nervous system is our main controller, our key controller of the brain. So our nervous system, when you think about it, it's divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system contains your brain and the spinal cord. The brain is this. The spinal cord is the cord that goes in through your vertebral column when we talked about the respiratory system. Your peripheral nervous system consists of your cranial nerves and spinal nerves. We're going to be talking about the cranial nerves because these are very important nerves for the production of speech and also some of the motor execution things. Okay. In order to understand about the nerves and how they function, we need to know what a neuron is. A neuron is a specialized cell that comprises the nervous system. If you remember from Dr. Fagelson's lecture, if you're in my A&P course, we talked about the types, the parts of a neuron. The neuron has a soma or a cell body, it has a dendron, and it has an axon. The axon is covered by myelin sheath, and this is the one that helps us in communicating or relaying information much faster. So if a neuron gets excited from the brain, it passes that information and it comes to the level of the muscle that needs to contract. When it comes to the level of the muscle, the communication happens in a place called the neuromuscular junction, where you have synapses and where you have these chemical transmitters or neurotransmitters called acetylcholine, which is one of the important ones. And that information from the axon is transmitted or received by the acetylcholine receptor at the neuromuscular junction, and your muscle excitation takes place. Now, do you need to know all of this? Probably not now. But I want you to know what a neuron is and how the neuron is helpful in communicating information. But I do want you to know that there are two kinds of neurons, an afferent neuron and an efferent neuron. An afferent neuron is a sensory neuron, meaning it carries information from your sense organs, your peripheral parts, to your central nervous system. So when we talk about the sensory system, think about if you're experiencing temperature changes or any touch, anything that you feel, pain, all of those is sensation, right? That sensation is carried from our peripheral sensory organs to our central nervous system, letting us what to know. So if I touch something that's hot, I move my hand back. The sensation first goes to the central nervous system, saying there is a heat, that's the afferent neuron. The efferent neuron, which is the motor neuron, says move your hand away, right? And that is an efferent neuron. The best way to remember this, afferent neuron, sensory, as, I know it's funny, but that's the afferent neuron. Efferent neuron is a motor neuron, me. So if you remember me, M-E, me, it's motor, efferent. Okay, efferent is the one that carries motor information. So if I wanted to lift this model, I have to send the neurotransmitter from the brain. The signal is sent saying use both your hands and coordinate in such a way that you lift it and balance it and not drop it down. Okay, so afferent neuron, efferent neuron. I do want to mention here that what we're talking about the central nervous system is very, very brief. This just covers, I'm really going on through like just the terminology, is very basic information, because in your A&P course you'll have a neuroanatomy section, and also when you come into the master's program you have an entire course dedicated to understanding the neuroanatomy and the neurophysiology and how it affects speech and what are the different disorders resulting from that. So I'm just introducing you to this concept, and this is very, very, very brief information, probably just a very layman term information and not even going into depth. Okay. So when we talk about our brain has two hemispheres. It has the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. Okay. So right, if I just put it like that, that's my brain. Right hemisphere, left hemisphere. These two hemispheres are separated in between, if you see here, by something called a cerebral longitudinal fissure or an interhemispheric. That is easy to remember, right? Between the two hemispheres, interhemispheric fissure. Now, before I talk to you about what the two hemispheres are known for, you need to understand that there are certain terminologies like the gyri and the sulcus or sulci. Gyrus or gyri are these protrusions or convolutions that you see, like mountain-like convolutions. The dips that you see between the gyri are known as sulcus. Deeper the sulcus, it's called a fissure. Okay, so you have two terms that you need to know, gyri and sulci. Gyri are mountains or convolutions that you see, those bumps that you see right here, and that's how our brain is too. If anybody has observed a human brain, um, not a real one, I mean some from a cadaver, you can see some bumps, and those bumps are called the gyri. And those little dips that you see are known as the sulci. The deeper the dips, they're called as fissures. So one such deeper dip is your cerebral longitudinal fissure that separates the two hemispheres. The left hemisphere is a hemisphere in, let me rephrase that. In individuals that are predominantly right-handed, the left hemisphere is mainly responsible for language, speech production, and speech perception. Anything to do with hearing in your left hemisphere, anything to do with how your language is processed, how do you produce different speech sounds, and those are in the left hemisphere. While your right hemisphere is more so related to art, music, photography, something to do with spatial relationship, directions in space, anything that is to do with the right hemisphere. Those that are left-handed, literature really doesn't delve into supporting whether the right hemisphere is dominant than the left. Okay, so they're still working on understanding in left-handed individuals what is the dominance of the left and right hemisphere. So, brain has two hemispheres, left and right, separated by the interhemispheric or the cerebral longitudinal fissure. The left is mainly responsible for language, speech production, speech perception. The right is more for spatial relationships, art, photography, music, and some people even talk about pragmatic concepts in that. All right. Now, each hemisphere, if I take this, can be divided into 4 lobes. Okay, there are 4 lobes in each hemisphere. You have the frontal lobe, which is the front of the brain. Then you have the parietal lobe, the one that you see in purple right here. You have the temporal lobe that you see down here, and then you have the occipital lobe right there. So frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. Okay. The frontal lobe is maybe one of the largest lobes. The separation between the frontal and the parietal lobe is by the fissure of Rolando or the central fissure. Remember, fissure is a in-depth or deeper sulci is a fissure. So the fissure that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe is your Rolandic fissure, or the fissure of Rolando, or the central fissure. You have the names right here if you can see, the fissure of Rolando or central fissure. The fissure that separates your parietal and frontal lobe from the temporal lobe is your lateral fissure, right there, is your lateral fissure or the Sylvian fissure. Okay, so the frontal lobe is one of the biggest lobes. Then you have the parietal lobe. Separating these two lobes is the Rolandic fissure or the fissure of Rolando or the central fissure. The sulcus or the fissure that separates your temporal lobe from the parietal and the frontal is going to be your lateral fissure or the Sylvian fissure. All right. Now, the frontal lobe is very important. The frontal lobe houses different areas. It has a motor speech area called the Broca's area right here, which is the area which is very important for execution of speech movements. So if you've heard individuals that have had a stroke and have lost the ability to speak, that becomes Broca's aphasia, where they can understand everything, but they're not able to execute the motor movements and not able to say something. This is very layman term. There's much more to this, okay? But I'm just explaining in very basic terms that this Broca's area or the motor speech area is responsible for executing motor speech movements. Some people can have apraxia or Broca's aphasia if this area is affected. Then you have the premotor area, which is or the motor strip area, which is important for voluntary movements, initiation, execution, inhibition of voluntary movements. Everything is controlled by that. Okay, so the motor area in planning, initiation, and inhibition of any voluntary motor movements is also controlled in areas of the frontal lobe. So frontal lobe is very important for motor speech, anything related to motor execution, motor planning, that involves motor execution, motor planning for speech as well. This parietal area is a sensory strip. Anything related to sensation is in the parietal area. Okay. The next area that is important is our temporal area. temporal area has two important areas that is important for us is the Heschel's gyrus and the Wernicke's area. Anything related to what you hear is in the Heschel's gyrus. Anything that your auditory system processes and sends it to the brain saying, I heard a bell, I heard a speed sound, that is it's by the Heschel's gyrus. The Wernicke's area is important for auditory comprehension, meaning how do you understand? If somebody says, move the pen to the table, or move the pen, lift the pen from under the table and place it on the table, those are auditory comprehension issues, and that is related to processing in the Wernicke's area. Those are both in the temporal lobe. Okay. Now, if anything goes wrong with the Heschel's gyrus, you will lose auditory input, meaning you won't hear anything. If anything goes wrong with the Wernicke's area, you will still be able to hear if the Heschel's gyrus is fine, but your Wernicke's area will prevent anything being comprehended. So individuals that have a stroke and have an injury to the Wernicke's area will not be able to comprehend anything. They will be able to say a lot of things if the Broca's area is fine, but they won't be able to understand anything. So far, we covered the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. Frontal is a very motor-oriented lobe. You have motor speech area, premotor area, and the motor strip, responsible for initiation, planning, and inhibition of any voluntary motor movements that involve speech movements too. Parietal area is a very sensory area, resulting in somatosensory information. Your temporal area is very important for hearing. Heschel's gyrus and Wernicke's area contribute to that. Occipital is obviously your vision area. Okay, we talked about the central fissure that separates the frontal and the parietal lobe, the lateral or the sylvian fissure that separates the parietal and frontal from your temporal lobe. Okay, that was the cerebrum. All of those structures that we talked were part of the cerebrum. That is, when the lobes get divided, when the hemispheres get divided, they can be divided into cerebrum, cerebellum, subcortex, brainstem. So all those four lobes are part of your cerebral cortex. Cerebellum, that you see right here, is the motor coordinating area. It coordinates respiration, phonation, articulation, etc. for speech. It is also a balance area. So, if you have ever observed an individual that is driving under influence, or even when a cop pulls over and asks them to walk in a straight line or touch the nose with one finger to check the ability of them to do those, everything in there is controlled by the cerebellum. So over a period of time, if individuals consume a lot of alcohol, the cerebellum area gets affected. And if individuals also, if you've observed individuals speak when they're drunk, you hear the slurred speech, slurring of their speech. That's because cerebellum controls and coordinates the articulation for speech. It's a very important structure for motor coordinating area and for balance. Then you have another structure called the subcortex that you see right here, which involves structures like the thalamus, the basal ganglia, and the hippocampus. I'm not going to go into details of that, but I do want you to know that these structures, the thalamus, basal ganglia, hippocampus are important structures of the subcortex. Okay, basal ganglia is also a structure that involves movement, inhibition and initiation of movements, motor movements. Hippocampus is an important area for memory. If something happens to your hippocampus, there is an impact on your memory. Okay. The brainstem, that is another important structure that you see right here. This is the brainstem. It has the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. This is important. This is important because it's the origin of a lot of cranial nerves. Okay, all of those 12 cranial nerves that you're going to see has its origin in the brainstem. It's also very important because this brainstem that you see is very important for basic life functions. It is for involuntary respiration and for that is the autonomic or involuntary respiration and for your blood pressure regulation. So if something happens to your brainstem, it's going to affect your breathing and it's going to affect your blood pressure regulation, which can in fact result in death. Okay. So far we talked about your cerebral cortex, which has the four lobes, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. We talked about the cerebellum, which is very important for coordination and balance. Then we talked about the subcortex, which has the thalamus, the basal ganglia, and the hippocampus. Hippocampus is important for memory. Basal ganglia is also for control of movement. We talked about the brainstem, very, very important because it controls basic life functions like respiration and blood pressure regulation, and it is the origin of a lot of the cranial nerves. Okay. When we talk about the cranial nerves, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And I'm not going to talk about all of these cranial nerves. I'm only going to point to you the cranial nerves that are involved in speech production. Out of the 12 pairs, the trigeminal nerve, which is cranial nerve 5, facial nerve 7, acoustic 8, glossopharyngeal 9, vagus 10, and hypoglossal 12. 6 nerves, 6 cranial nerves are involved in speech production. Let's go over them again. Trigeminal, which is cranial nerve 5, facial, cranial nerve 7, acoustic, cranial nerve 8, glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve 9, vagus 10, hypoglossal 12. What I want you to know is the name of the cranial nerve, the cranial number, the number of the cranial nerve, whether it's a motor and a sensory nerve. Okay, all of that information is right here. So trigeminal is a motor and a sensory nerve. Remember, afferent and efferent. So the trigeminal nerve will carry sensory information, will also bring in motor information. The facial nerve is primarily a motor nerve, but there is some sensory information too. All of the facial nerve will supply to your facial muscles like the tongue, all of the facial muscles. The acoustic nerve is a sensory nerve for hearing. Some people say it also has some motor ability, but for my purposes of the class, I want you to know that acoustic nerve is a sensory nerve to perceive hearing. Glossopharyngeal is a motor nerve for the pharynx, pharyngeal muscles, which helps in swallowing, and it gets sensory information from the tongue. So if you remember, glosso is tongue, pharyngeal is the pharynx. So glossopharyngeal is a mixed nerve. It gives motor information to the pharyngeal muscles involved in swallowing, and it takes sensory information from the tongue. The vagus is a very long nerve. It does a lot of functions, okay? And it's a motor and a sensory nerve. I'm going to leave it at that. When we talk in the anatomy and physiology course, we'll talk more about the detail of it. The hypoglossa is a motor nerve, and glossal meaning tongue, so it's a motor nerve for tongue movements. Sensory nerve for tongue movements is through the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, 6 nerves that are involved, cranial nerves. Out of the 12 pairs, 6 pairs are involved in speech production. The trigeminal, the facial, acoustic, glossopharyngeal, vagus, and hypoglossal. I want you to know whether it's a motor nerve or a sensory nerve or both, motor and sensory. All right. That's just a depiction of what you see the nerves are. So what you see right here is the brainstem, which has the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and it serves as an origin. See how you see that? Serves as an origin for the cranial nerves. Okay. Spinal nerves are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. It has motor and sensory information from and to the spinal cord. That's all I want you to know. How many pairs of spinal nerves are there, and it has motor and sensory information from and to the spinal cord. So that's your vertebral column. Your spinal cord goes through in between this vertebral column, and look at all those nerves: cervical nerves, thoracic nerves, lumbar nerves, sacral nerves, and those branches will supply different parts of your body in terms of legs, hands, etc. Now, why is it important for us to understand this in our speech production systems or speech production lecture? Left hemisphere is predominant for the control of speech. This is more so true for right-handed individuals. For speech, there is simultaneous activity of different parts of the brain. It's not as simple as, okay, this is the part that is responsible for speech, and here you go, I'm able to produce. No, there are lots of things that is involved in the production of speech. Your Broca's area is involved in the planning and initiation, and then your somatosensory receives information of tactile feedback, how your tongue is moving, where it's touching, things like that. Auditory comprehension is what you understand and how you produce. There is this whole involved, and there is some control on the right hemisphere too in terms of pragmatics. So if you can see, the speech is a very complex process, and then you have to use this brain, which is the controller, to be able to execute your final output, that is speech. All right, that sums up our part 3 for our speech production systems and speech production lecture. So you have the respiratory system, the phonatory system, and the nervous system. And as I said, all of these systems have been covered in very, very brief amount. And if you're taking my A&P course, you'll get in a lot of details. For individuals that are not in my anatomy and physiology course, if you would like in-depth information about these systems, please send me an email and I can provide you with the link where I've recorded everything in detail. All right. We will continue with the next lecture on Introduction to Vowels.